where she worked for over 24 years, retiring as a sergeant in 2021. She managed 22 real-time crime centers across Chicago, received the Superintendent's Award of Merit for your service. She is also coincidentally a survivor of the 2017 mass shooting at Route 91 Harvest Festival in Las Vegas. The two minority witnesses are Zach Smith, thank you for being here, Senior Legal Fellow and Manager of the Supreme Court and Appellate Advocacy Program for the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies of the Heritage Foundation, and Ryan Cleckner, former Special Operations Sniper Team Leader with the U.S. Army's 1st Ranger Battalion, also an attorney who represents federal firearm licensees and helps them to stay compliant with federal laws and regulations. I want to thank all our witnesses and ask them to please rise for the administration of the oath. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect that all of the witnesses, thank goodness, answered in the affirmative so that we can go forward. And we're going to start with Mr. Ludwig.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. I'm here to talk about a particularly troubling trend that we're seeing in the data, which reflects a particularly troubling trend that we're seeing on the streets of America. In the past several years, we're seeing a rise all across the country in the so-called shooting fatality rate, defined as the fraction of gunshot victims that wind up dying as a result of their wounds. In my hometown of Chicago, the fraction of shootings that resulted in the victim's death has increased by 6 percentage points. That's about 50% since 2010. Research by Janet Lauritsen and Theodore Lentz shows something similar is happening all across the United States. That's to say, this isn't a problem that seems to be unique to Chicago. It's not unique to other big cities. It's not unique to suburbs, rural areas, red states or blue states. It seems to be a problem everywhere. When we look at the data to see why this is happening, the explanation that's best supported seems to be a large increase in the number of rounds fired per shooting. And a significant contributor to the increase in the number of rounds fired per shooting seems to be the use of things like Glock switches and bump stocks, what are sometimes called machine gun conversion devices. As was mentioned in the opening statement, these devices modify semi-automatic firearms so they fire automatically, functionally equivalent to a machine gun. A switch does so for a handgun, a bump stock for a rifle. In Chicago, the number of firearms recovered that have been modified by these devices to fire automatically has increased. It was just 9 in 2010. So it was 9 in 2010, and in 2023, that number had increased to fully 465. In fact, just that last week, only a few miles from my house on the south side of Chicago, a Chicago police officer named Enrique Martinez was carrying out a traffic stop in the Chatham neighborhood and was shot and killed with a weapon outfitted with one of these switches. This proliferation of machine gun conversion devices, together with the growing use of high-capacity magazines, have contributed to this large increase in rounds fired and shooting fatality rates. Now, I know that a shooting fatality rate is a very abstract way to think about the real-world impact of the problem. So I want to offer a different way to think about the public safety implications of this that might be more concrete. In the city of Chicago, where I live, we've averaged something like 2,000 to 3,000 shootings per year since I've lived there in 2007. A 6 percentage point increase in the shooting fatality rate since 2010 means that there are 184 more murders that happened in 2023 in Chicago than would have happened if the shooting fatality rate had been the same. 184 murders in Chicago is about 1/3 of all the murders that happened in my hometown. That's a huge proportional increase in the total number of people killed at the hands of someone else as a result of these trends in what's happening with firearms. So what might be done? The good news is that the data suggests there are multiple potentially helpful paths forward. Of course, Glock switches, as was mentioned by Senator Durbin, Glock switches are already illegal under federal law. Evidence to suggest that ban is helpful comes from the data that looks at the 1934 National Firearms Act, which resulted in a sharp drop in the number of shootings with machine guns that happened in the United States. What else could be done? When I talk to my friends who are Chicago police officers, one thing they tell me they're increasingly worried about is the possibility that 3D printers are being used to create these switches. Whether there are legislative ways to make that harder could be one policy the data suggests might be worth exploring, and has some analogs to policies that make it harder, for instance, for color printers to print counterfeit money. There's a large body of evidence from social science showing the deterrent effects of prosecution and sentencing. That suggests the potential value of ensuring or potentially enhancing the capacity of local U.S. attorneys' offices to investigate and prosecute gun crimes involving machine gun conversion devices. Finally, some of the work that my own research center, the University of Chicago Crime Lab, has been doing with different government agencies and nonprofits suggests there are different social programs that can help prevent young people from picking up guns in the first place and using them against other people, which seems particularly valuable in a world in which these guns are getting more lethal over time. Beyond specific possible solutions, the main point I would like to emphasize here is that on the long list of things that we could be worried about, from a public safety perspective, this increase in shooting lethality needs to be, in my opinion, near the very top. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Chairman Durman, Ranking Member Graham, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Zach Smith, and I currently serve as a senior legal fellow in the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Before joining Heritage, I served for several years as an assistant United States attorney, worked in private practice, and clerked for the Honorable Emmett R. Cox on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Fundamentally, today's hearing is focused on the wrong solution aimed at the wrong problem. Contrary to the title of today's hearing, there is not a gun violence epidemic in our country, but there is a violent crime epidemic. And unfortunately, too many elected leaders are refusing to take the simple yet necessary steps needed to combat this crime epidemic, namely funding the police and prosecuting criminals. But why are elected leaders reluctant to take these common sense steps? Unfortunately, too many have bought into the twin myths that our criminal justice system is systemically racist, which it's not, and that we have a mass incarceration problem, or that we lock up too many people in our country. We don't. But many have called for policy choices to be made based on these faulty assumptions. For example, the Brennan Center for Justice has called for the prison population to be reduced by 39%. The ACLU has called for a 50% reduction, and one academic has even proposed policies that would result in an 85% drop in the number of people behind bars. These proposals are astounding because most people behind bars today are serving time in prison for committing violent crimes. As I've explained elsewhere, the vast majority of people in prison today are serving time in state prisons, and the vast majority of state prisoners are there for committing crimes such as murder, manslaughter, robbery, aggravated assault, or other crimes, including gun-related crimes. According to 2022 statistics, those convicted of violent crimes make up 62.9% of all state prisoners. So reducing the prison population by 50% or more necessarily means not locking up or releasing from prison early, clearly violent criminals. We also know that repeat offending is a fact of life with criminals, with many offenders going on to reoffend again after leaving prison. And we know that aside from the seriousness of someone's crime, nothing affects that individual's sentence more than their own criminal history. This generally means that when someone repeatedly commits more crimes, their subsequent sentences tend to be, and likely should be, harsher. In states such as California that have adopted 3 strikes laws, these harsher sentences have increased the prison population. But guess what? These laws are effective at combating crime. Sadly, many elected officials at the local and state levels, as well as federal leaders, have ignored common sense policies and have instead pushed policies that hurt public safety. One simple action that any Justice Department should pursue is an emphasis on felon in possession prosecution, Section 922G cases, as they're colloquially known after the relevant U.S. Code section. This provision makes it illegal for those who have been convicted of a felony and those who meet certain other requirements to possess a firearm. Think about it. By definition, if someone is convicted of this offense, They already have a felony conviction. They're disregarding relevant laws by illegally possessing a firearm, and from a resource perspective, these cases tend to be straightforward to prosecute and are very effective in targeting individuals who are often drivers of violent crime in their own communities. The Justice Department under the Trump administration prioritized prosecuting these cases, particularly in jurisdictions burdened with rogue prosecutors at the local level, and hopefully will prioritize them again. The District of Columbia, with its unique status, also provides insight into what happens when local leaders defund the police and prosecutors refuse to prosecute crimes. Crime rates, including gun crimes, increase as a result. Because of the district's unique status, subject to Congress's control, reforming these problematic policies should be a top priority. Finally, the committee does deserve praise for holding today's hearing in at least two regards. First, today's hearing focuses, albeit indirectly, on victims. Too often today, criminals are treated as victims, and the true victims are the forgotten component when discussing crime, violence, and criminal justice reforms. Second, the committee deserves praise for considering this problem rather than passing the task to unelected, unaccountable individuals in administrative agencies. So while this committee's time and efforts would be better spent focused on the violent crime epidemic taking place across our country, at least the conversation is taking place here with the American people's elected representatives. I appreciate the committee's invitation to testify, and I welcome the committee's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Ms. Sanchez-Gomez.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin and members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Esther Sanchez-Gomez, and I'm the Litigation Director with Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. I'm here to talk to you about machine guns, dangerous weapons that Congress has taken action on repeatedly and for which there's no constitutional impediment to legislation. But I'd like to begin by reflecting on the origins of the organization that I represent. Nearly 14 years ago, in my hometown, Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was shot in the head during a constituent event. On that January morning in Tucson in 2011, 6 people were killed and 12 others injured. 6 years later, my fellow panelist Laura O'Donnell survived a different mass shooting, one that killed 60 people and injured 500 more. That gunman equipped his firearms with bump stocks. When a rifle is modified with a bump stock, the shooter only needs to pull the trigger once and the gun will fire continuously, so long as the shooter keeps his trigger finger stationary and applies forward pressure by leaning into the bump stock. The shooting heard at the scene that day was accurately described as machine gun fire. Perhaps the biggest tragedy is that these shootings aren't just isolated moments in our nation's history, but examples of the sort of preventable gun violence that continues to ravage this country. In response to the 2017 Las Vegas shooting, and under President Trump's direction, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF, amended its regulations to make clear that bump stocks meet the current federal definition of a machine gun. As machine guns, they were subject to the federal ban. But this past June, the Supreme Court supplanted its firearms expertise for that of the ATF and issued a decision in Garland v. Cargill striking down ATF's regulation. Although bump stocks are currently regulated by a number of states, they are now legal under federal law. Unfortunately, bump stocks aren't the only devices equipping shooters with weapons capable of automatic fire. In March of this year, 8 high schoolers were shot while waiting at a bus stop in Philadelphia. The shooter fired 30 rounds in mere seconds. The gunman was able to do so because his Glock handgun was equipped with an autosear. Autosears are small Lego-sized machine gun conversion devices. They can be easily inserted into a firearm, allowing it to fire continuously with a single pull of the trigger. These devices are also called switches or Glock switches because of their pervasive use on Glock pistols. Unlike bump stocks, autosears are classified as machine guns under federal law and are currently illegal. Despite this, autosears have proliferated significantly in recent years with the help of online marketplaces and the rise of 3D printing technology. ATF's most recent data shows that there was a 570% increase. 570% increase in autosears recovered by the agency during the last decade. That statistic is, sadly, borne out in the lived trauma of our communities. This isn't the first period of American life marred by machine gun violence. During the 1920s and 30s, the country was rocked by a gun violence epidemic fueled by Prohibition-era organized crime. This violence spurred Congress to action. They passed the National Firearms Act in 1934 to regulate automatic firearms through registration and taxation. As technology changed, our regulation of automatic firearms has adapted to keep pace. Since 1934, Congress has acted twice to address the violence that the proliferation of machine guns and conversion devices causes. First, in 1968, Congress expanded the definition of machine gun to include a combination of parts that could convert a weapon into a machine gun. Then, in 1986, Congress completely banned civilian ownership of newly manufactured machine guns. Congress has repeatedly taken action to regulate machine guns and address technological advances and workarounds. The violence we see perpetrated today with bump stocks and auto sears can be prevented. Congress has the constitutional authority to ban bump stocks, and Congress can grant ATF and other federal law enforcement agencies the resources to properly enforce these laws. We aren't condemned to live in a society where every shooting is a mass shooting. Our schools, places of worship, political rallies, concerts, and other gatherings need to be protected from gun violence. The Supreme Court has made clear that you can act, and the harm occurring in our communities compels you to do so. Thank you again, Chairman Durbin and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, for the opportunity to testify here today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks, Ms. Sanchez-Gomez. Mr. Cleckner, before you begin, let me thank you for serving our country. You're welcome today to start your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin and senators of the committee. I'm Ryan Cleckner. I'm an attorney specializing in federal firearms law and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives Compliance. I'm here today as a firearms expert to talk about the legal and technical qualities and the differences between bump stocks and conversion devices. And I'd like to address them separately because they are two very different things. Now, a machine gun under the National Firearms Act is a firearm that will expel more than one bullet for a single operation of the trigger. Bump stocks are not machine guns. They are pieces of plastic that can be put onto some firearms in place of their standard butt stock that allow someone to bump fire the firearm. Now, the term bump fire, that's not illegal. Matter of fact, I can bump fire a firearm without a bump stock. Bump firing is nothing more than allowing a firearm to move rearward under its recoil and then be pulled back into a stationary trigger finger. Now, bump stocks do make it easier for some people to bump fire, but that's all they are. The fundamental operation of the firearm has not been changed. The trigger still needs to be manipulated every single time a bullet comes out of the firearm, just like it was designed and intended. Now, putting this into perspective of how big of a problem bump stocks by themselves are, the FBI's most recent crime stats from last year say that all rifles were used in about 15,000 incidences of violent crime. Includes all categories of violent crime by the FBI. Blunt objects, such as hammers, were used 78,000 times. More than 5 times more than all rifles, not just rifles which could have a bump stock, or even the smaller category of rifles that actually did have a bump stock on them. The only evidence I can find of a bump stock being used is the horrible, horrific 2017 Las Vegas shooting. And what that mass murderer did was horrific. I don't think a bump stock being on some of his firearms makes a difference enough to try to redefine the law about what these items are. Now, these conversion devices, or Glock switches, or auto sears, they are absolutely machine guns. Okay? Not only did the National Firearms Act define the firearm, but later laws, like the Gun Control Act, says that any parts that can be used to convert a firearm into a machine gun are also a firearm. That's what these things are. They're already heavily regulated. They're already completely illegal. The ATF is already going out of the way to enforce this rise that we have with them being used. But the vast majority of them that I know of are being imported right now into this country, and they're not being stopped as they're being imported in this country. I think the way that we solve this problem is not to make an item more illegal, because its status of being a significantly illegal item does nothing, apparently, to stop these criminals from using them. I mean, that's the definition of a criminal, right? Someone who doesn't obey the law. I don't think we can make them more illegal. And if we did, I don't think that's going to stop their use. I think what's going to stop their use is if we actually prosecute the criminals that are using these illegal items. If we keep these dangerous people off the streets, and we do maybe the best we can to stop the influx of these items across our border. I'm also seeing lawsuits right now against firearms companies like Glock, saying that their design somehow invites the use of these devices. I think on its face that's false. I think the reason that there are common with Glocks is because Glocks are so common. 60% or more of law enforcement across the country uses Glock pistols. The Capitol Police I passed on the way in this building had Glock pistols on. That's why they're so common. I think lawsuits against these companies, I think a misguided focus on trying to make certain items more illegal is only going to harm more Americans, because the real solution is getting the bad people off the streets. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cleckner. Mrs. O'Donnell?
Good morning, Chairman Durbin and committee members. My name is Laura O'Donnell. I'm a retired Chicago police lieutenant, and I am one of the over 22,000 survivors of the 2017 Route 91 Music Festival in Las Vegas. I spent over 24 years serving some of the most violent areas of Chicago. I'm accustomed to seeing people on their worst day. I've witnessed numerous crime scenes, gunshot victims, and even people taking their final breath. Yet nothing could have prepared me for October 1st, 2017, the day of the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. We all know what happened that night. However, I'd like you to hear it firsthand. My husband, best friend, coworker, and I, all Chicago police officers, along with my sister-in-law, who's a nurse, traveled to Las Vegas to attend a 3-day country concert. On the last night, at 10:05 p.m., the unimaginable and indescribable chaos began. We heard a pop, 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 at first thinking it was fireworks, but then a few seconds later we heard it again, and we knew it was gunfire. My husband pushed us all to the ground, and he laid his body over ours. As you can hear the bullets hitting the ground, and screams surrounded us. When the shooting momentarily paused, we tried to escape, but encountered a bottleneck of people. As more gunfire erupted, we were separated from my friends. We dropped to the ground, but realized the risk of getting trampled. With the gates being locked, people started climbing 8-foot fences, desperate to escape. As police officers, we're trained to seek cover when under gunfire, but the only protection was these metal bleachers. Bullets struck them, echoing with a ping, ping sound, while the smell of burning food filled the air as rounds hit the metal grills in the concession stands. Through a slot of the bleachers, I watched my husband move cautiously through the venue, urging people to drop everything and go, while checking on those lying on the ground amid hundreds of bullets. I feared he might get hit and die right in front of me. When you're in a fight or flight response, your body shuts down everything that's not essential. Things seem to move in slow motion, and it's difficult to process anything. However, I remember thinking, how can this still be going on? How can someone still be firing rounds? I also remember trying to think of the last things I said to my 3 children, my twin, and my younger sister. I had thought I might die, and I had hoped that I told them I loved them. When the shooting finally stopped, I have no memory of the minutes that followed as we passed the medical tent. I sometimes wonder how chaotic and horrific it must have been that my mind blocks it, yet other memories are still so vivid to this day. In the aftermath of the shooting, I was in a daze. My mind was moving slow, yet I was hypervigilant. I had trouble sleeping, and I struggled to cope with flashbacks. I had survivor's guilt. I often wondered, why am I still here? Why not me? Panic attacks struck me in places like the grocery store, and I would leave without buying anything. Leaving home alone felt unsafe, especially in crowds. I wanted some control of my normal life back, so I returned to work, but it was challenging. At the time, I was a coordinator of the first SDSC, basically a real-time crime center, in one of the most violent areas of Chicago, Inglewood. One of my duties was to listen to audio of gunfire captured by ShotSpotter. As you can probably imagine, it was distressing for me, and I needed to take more time off of work. I sought help through my employee assistance program and returned to work, but triggers of the shooting would lead to heightened anxiety during scenario-based training and firearm qualifications. It was difficult to be in charge of officers during major events with large crowds and fireworks. I knew I needed more help. I began cognitive behavioral therapy with a trauma therapist who worked with law enforcement. I joined a weekly support group through the Vegas Strong Resiliency Center. I also attended an intensive inpatient therapy program at Onsite called Triumph Over Tragedy for mass shooting survivors. There, I learned coping skills that I still rely on today. 7 years later, loud noises, crowded places, outdoor concerts, just to name a few, still activate me. To give you an example, a coworker once invited me to a Cubs game, and this is how it plays out in my mind. It's an outdoor venue. It's going to be crowded. Will I be sitting near an exit? I'll make sure to wear gym shoes in case I need to run. This usually leads me to decline invites to things I once enjoyed. I have my life before Route 91, and I have my life after Route 91. I know there must be a purpose to my life and a reason I survived. Maybe telling my story here today is one of those reasons. The shooter had 23 weapons, including 14 modified with a bump stock, turning them into fully automatic weapons capable of firing over 100 rounds in 10 seconds. That's almost 10 times more than without that modification. While I was in the venue, he unleashed over 1,000 rounds in 11 agonizing minutes. 400 people were shot, over 800 were injured, 58 people died that day, 36 women, 22 men. The 3 youngest were only 20 years old. I believe that if the shooter did not have a bump stock, more people would have escaped, less people would have been injured, and of course, less would have died. Every day, I think of those people who lost their lives. Do not let these lives be forgotten. Links to the gunfire are in my written testimony. I urge you all to take the time to listen to it and take action today to ban these modifications to prevent future tragedies. Just last week, Chicago police officer Enrique Martinez was killed in the line of duty by a firearm modified with a switch, making it fully automatic. There's no good reason to turn a semi-automatic weapon into a machine gun. Despite my progress, the scars from October 1st, 2017 continue to impact my life. It's a day that I will never forget. It will never be forgotten by the 22,000 survivors or the family members of those who died. I hope you honor their memory, as our lives will never be the same. Thank you.
Thank you, not only for your testimony about that horrible day in your life, but for your service as a police officer in Chicago. It's not an easy assignment, and I respect the fact that you did it for over 20 years. So let me ask you this. Do you think most policemen that you served with in Chicago or in other places would agree that bump stocks have no place to be sold in the United States?
Yes, I believe most police officers would agree with me with that.
Mr. Cleckner, you and Mr. Smith seem to zero in on the mechanics of mass shooting. When we think of the purpose of the Second Amendment for self-defense, sport, and hunting, is there a circumstance that you think in the ordinary course of life where you need to have that capacity of a firearm?
Senator Durbin, respectfully, I think you're missing a category of why the Second Amendment exists. We wrote it shortly after overthrowing a tyrannical government, and I think that a bump stock, although has no application for hunting and maybe not very much for self-defense, I don't believe that banning this item would stop a criminal that's already willing to ignore so many other laws.
You just mixed two things up. We talked about ending tyranny against the United States, and you talked about a criminal in the same breath.
Fair.
I don't understand.
What I'm saying, sir, is, Senator, is that banning an item or making it illegal is not going to prevent a criminal from using it. It's already illegal for that shooter to be a mass murderer. It's already illegal for them to do many other things that the laws did not prevent them from doing.
So let's stick with your logic. What's the point of banning machine guns?
Well, machine guns, Senator, are actually legal. They are legal for some people to possess. They're just extremely regulated. And I
Is that a
believe
violation of constitutional right to regulate that firearm?
I think most gun laws are infringements of the Second Amendment. Yes, Senator.
Well, I think that's where we're going to part company, because I think most people would agree, even firearm owners in my own family, that reasonable regulation is not too much to ask if it means saving the life of innocent people. When you hear Mrs. O'Donnell's portrayal of what happened, you described it as a mass murder.
Yes.
You described it as horrific. And to think that some regulation might slow down the purchase of a device which converts a regular gun into an automatic gun, semi-automatic into automatic gun, is an unreasonable restriction on the constitutional rights. I think that's where we would disagree, certainly would. Ms. Sanchez-Gomez, when it comes to the incidents of mass shootings and the proliferation of these devices, what do you see lies ahead?
I think it's incredibly important that we regulate these weapons. Machine guns are designed to do one thing: kill a lot of people in a very short amount of time. We have been regulating machine guns in this country since the beginning of the 20th century. We made them unlawful for civilian ownership in the 1980s, and we need to extend into the future our regulation of machine guns to incorporate changes in technology, workarounds that the gun industry has found for the current state of the law. And there is no constitutional impediment for doing so.
I think of the situation just a few years ago in Highland Park, Illinois on the 4th of July, when people were assembled for a 4th of July parade, and there were many members of law enforcement there who were watching the scene and even marching in the parade, and a lone shooter got on the roof of a building and fired off, I believe, 83 rounds in 60 seconds, killing 7 people and injuring dozens of others. It was a young man who had some mental issues before that day, and his father decided that a good thing for him to do was to buy this type of assault weapon and practice with it at a shooting range. It prepared him for that awful day which changed lives in every direction. I look at that and think, what is the purpose of his ownership of that gun? Is it to stop tyranny? According to Mr. Cleckner, that's one of the elements that went into the Founding Fathers' calculation of the Second Amendment. What do you think about that?
The Supreme Court has been incredibly clear that military-style weapons are not protected by the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court has explained that any reading of the Second Amendment and of the court's decisions would be startling if it implied that the NFA and its regulations of machine guns was unconstitutional.
Professor Ludwig, when you hear Mr. Smith describe this as a gun violence problem or a crime problem and not an issue that should involve firearms, I don't think he mentioned bump stock in his testimony, maybe once at the beginning. What is your reaction?
I think one potentially useful comparison is the United States versus the United Kingdom. When you look at rates of, so there's a sense in which Mr. Smith is right that there are countries around the world that have lots of guns and very low crime rates, and that does not lead to lots of gun violence. But there are other countries around the world which have similar rates of violent crime to the United States, similar numbers of robberies, similar number of assaults, countries like the United Kingdom, and they have almost no guns. And what you see in countries with lots of violent crime and no guns is very, very few murders. So London is a city that's 3 times the size of Chicago. They have fewer murders per year than my hometown. The thing that makes violent crime so deadly in the United States is the ready availability of guns. As you and many in the room know, we have something like 400 million guns in circulation and 330 million Americans. And I think there's lots of evidence from the data suggests that widespread gun availability increases the lethality of the violent crime that happens. And I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that the availability of these machine gun conversion devices further increases the lethality of firearms.
Thanks, Professor. Senator Klobuchar.
Very good. Thank you, Chairman, for having this very important hearing right now. I'll start with you, Professor Ludwig, with the facts. In 2023, police in Minneapolis reported that they recovered 3 times as many Glock switches as they did when they first started tracking them in 2021. That's only in 2 years. Could you talk, and we've seen these same kind of numbers nationally, how does the increased proliferation of illegal machine gun conversion devices threaten public safety?
So we're seeing these increases, unfortunately, as you note, Senator, in every big city in which I've been able to see the data, we're seeing these increases. I think the challenge that the growing use of machine gun conversion devices play, maybe combined with the availability of high-capacity magazines, means now that more and more people are able to fire off larger numbers of rounds over a shorter period of time. We can see in the data that that's leading to more shots fired per shooting incident, more injuries per shooting event, and higher lethality rates. Even modest changes in the shooting lethality rate winds up leading to very outsized increases in the number of people who die as a result of gun violence.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez-Gomez, I introduced legislation to require federal law enforcement to coordinate with our state and locals because of what we're seeing in my former job as a prosecutor. And in fact, one of parts of this that we have to look going forward as there are efforts to reduce or defund not the ATF on the national basis coming from some of our federal colleagues. I just want to give one example of ATF working with the St. Paul Police Department, Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and our U.S. Attorney, who's well respected on both sides of the aisle, Andy Luger, to investigate and convict a teenager who led police down a high-speed chase after firing a Glock equipped with a machine gun conversion device into a densely populated neighborhood. Can you talk about the importance of funding ATF in addition to putting in place better safety guardrails when it comes to these devices?
Thank you, Senator. I think that that's exactly right. We need to be giving law enforcement the resources that they're asking for. We've been hearing from attorneys general across the country and from ATF and from local law enforcement that they need more education and more resources to understand the scope of the problem and to address it at the source, which is, one, importantly, preventing these items from being trafficked into the country and preventing them from ending up in the hands of people who would use them to do harm. Harm like the harm that occurred in Detroit, Michigan, when 2 people were killed and 19 others injured at a neighborhood block party. It's important that we give law enforcement the tools that they're asking for. These are already illegal, as been mentioned a number of times, and preventing them from ending up in our communities is the most important first step in combating the problem.
Thank you. Ms. O'Donnell, thank you for your work and your searing testimony. I believe we need to do more to protect our law enforcement officers and support them. That's why I lead the Cops Reauthorization Bill and have done a lot of work in this area. Could you talk about the challenges that law enforcement face when responding to gun violence incidences that involve handguns that are illegally modified into automatic?
Thank you for the question. What I could say is I think just the last few officers from Chicago who died in the line of duty were all from switches. So you don't have time to react. They're firing too fast. We don't have the same weapons firing back. So it is a big problem. It's definitely multiplied in the last few years, as Professor Ludwig said. And it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I sit here, I remember one of our earlier hearings on firearms legislation, and both the minority witnesses, as well, in fact, the entire panel consisting of majority minority witnesses, said they agree that this nation is awash in guns. And Mr. Ludwig, you mentioned that we have over 400 million guns and 330 million Americans. So we are awash in guns. I mean, is there anybody on this panel who does not think that we are awash in guns in this country? Raise your hand if you think otherwise. Okay, so we are awash in guns, and meanwhile, the Supreme Court in various decisions, Heller was pretty much an astounding decision to me when suddenly individuals could, the Second Amendment, individuals could own firearms, but Scalia did say that we could legislate various kinds of limitations, I suppose that you could call it that. And then you fast forward to the Bruin decision, where suddenly we're supposed to look to what the founding fathers thought about in, 1791, or some astounding time frame such as that. Bruin has led to some unintended consequences, by the way. So here we sit, debating about whether or not we should put some limits on these kinds of enhanced weapons. My staff person just showed me a video of how fast these enhanced weapons shoot, and I can understand why. In the Las Vegas situation, so many people were killed. Astounding, horrifying. And just listening to the firepower of these weapons, one questions whether or not these should be illegal at all, and we should not be sitting here talking about whether ATF can regulate these firearms or whether it is somehow left to Congress. Hey, good luck with that. So I hardly know where to start. But maybe... it does occur to me that there are very few instances where Congress has rendered companies to be immune. So gun manufacturers are immune from the consequences of people using their products. So, Mr. Ludwig, is there a possibility that gun manufacturers is making them liable? Is that an approach that we should consider?
I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't want to. Thank you for the question, Senator. I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't want to speak to the legality of that. I think what I would, as an economist and a social scientist, I would talk about the larger data and evidence about the effects of product regulation. And I think we have lots of examples from other products like motor vehicles where changing product designs have led to massive improvements in safety, whether that's through litigation approaches or regulation approaches. We can see that when products become safer, products that are prone to misuse, that can wind up leading to lives.
Do we not have any lawyers on the panel? Okay, so Ms. Sanchez-Gomez?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're a lawyer.
Yes.
Yes. What about holding manufacturers liable?
I think it's a really, really important point. I think regulating the gun industry in the way that we regulate other industries using litigation, which changes incentives for them to act in ways that are responsible, to act in ways that prevent the foreseeable harmful consequences of their actions, is an incredibly important tool of our civil legal system.
Could states hold gun manufacturers liable? Or is this an area that only the federal government can act?
Well, the federal government Congress passed a law that gives the gun industry broad immunity. It's not absolute immunity, but it is very broad and unprecedented for this industry. And so the federal government is the one that needs to act if we want to repeal that immunity.
Well, but the question is, can states act? Can states enact legislation that holds gun manufacturers liable?
Yeah, absolutely. And states are passing laws.
Okay, I think that's one of the ways that we can proceed. So the fact of the matter is, as I watch what the Supreme Court is doing, and I have described, by the way, this Supreme Court majority as an out-of-control Supreme Court, because I have a growing list of precedents that this Supreme Court is tossing out in so many areas of the law, and they're not done yet. So I just want to say to this committee and my wonderful members of the Judiciary Committee that I think we need to pay attention to Supreme Court reform, starting with that they don't even have any ethics provisions that apply to them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That's an issue we've talked about a lot, and I hope we'll continue to. Ms. Sanchez-Gomez, how is it that a person can buy a 3D printer with instructions from the internet to create a Glock switch for a ghost gun? What is that all about?
Glock switches are incredibly small devices. They're Lego-sized devices that are very simplistic, easy to manufacture, and that's also why they're so easy to traffic into this country. They're small, they're difficult to detect, and that's why a bill like Senator Klobuchar's, which would give resources to law enforcement to prevent these from being trafficked into the country, to detect, marketing that is deceptive to consumers, that implies that these are lawful to own. That's why we need to get ahead of this problem, to stop it from getting into our communities in every direction.
Why are pistols equipped with another device, which we haven't spoken much about, the stabilizing brace, particularly dangerous to the public?
So stabilizing braces are not machine guns. I want to start off by being clear. When we talk about stabilizing braces, we're talking about short-barreled rifles. And short-barreled rifles are more dangerous because they allow a pistol to be shot from the shoulder, which gives it more power and more velocity, and therefore more lethality, but still being concealable in the way that a pistol is because it's smaller. Stabilizing braces were initially designed to allow a shooter to stabilize a handgun on the wrist or forearm. But what started happening was that the gun industry saw a loophole where they began designing stabilizing braces that allowed a shooter to shoot from the shoulder, thereby converting that weapon into a short-barreled rifle, which is regulated under the National Firearms Act, subject to taxation and registration.
Mr. Cleckner, what do you think about that?
I don't think pistol braces are a problem. I don't think they're being used in crimes. I don't think they're making crimes worse. I think she brings up a great point about the concealability. I think it makes it much harder to conceal a pistol when there's a pistol brace on. It makes it much larger. And if we're going to talk about increased lethality and velocity, a pistol brace does neither of those. In fact, a regular rifle has increased velocity and lethality, and that has a regular butt stuck on it, which is arguably worse than a pistol brace.
So pistols with braces have been used in several mass shootings in Dayton, Ohio, and Boulder, Colorado, but you don't think that's a problem?
I'm not saying it's a problem that they're being used, Senator. I think that, like I said before, I think banning them is not going to stop it any more than the banning mass murder is going to stop it.
Ms. Gomez, any reaction to that?
When we talk about firearms, we know that access to firearms is a key tool in reducing firearm violence, in reducing gun violence. And I think that regulating access to dangerous weapons like machine guns, like short-barreled rifles, is an important tool that we have to reduce gun violence in this country.
I see Senator Blumenthal has returned. He's now recognized.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Thank you for having this hearing. And, I must say, as I talk to law enforcement personnel in Connecticut and around the country, these kinds of conversion devices, call them Glock switches, whatever, are among their biggest worries because they're on the firing line. They're the ones who often are targets, and they're outmatched when their adversaries, criminals, have these kinds of devices that can convert semi-automatics into automatics. And even if you say they should be permitted to some extent, I'm wondering whether gun manufacturers don't have a responsibility to make devices that they sell safer. And I know that Senator Hirono kind of raised PLCA. I have been a longtime advocate of repealing PLCA and enabling litigants who have been harmed the opportunity to take action against gun manufacturers just as they do against manufacturers of cars, toasters, most consumer products, all consumer products, except some that are given a specific exemption. So, Mr. Ludwig, let me ask you, are there ways that private litigants, if given the right to take action, and I was Attorney General of the state of Connecticut for some 20 years, but I used to welcome the people I called private attorneys general, who vindicated the public interest by taking action on their own behalf. would gun manufacturers have more of an incentive to make their products safer and to avoid the kind of advertising that they do now, often appealing to young men as a matter of their manhood, if there were the right of individuals to take action in our courts?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I'm an economist. I look at data for a living. We haven't had lots of these regulations in the past, so we don't have a lot of data to look at what would happen in the case of firearms specifically. But we can look at other consumer products where we've changed incentives for manufacturers. I mentioned automobiles earlier. There's a long list of examples of whether it's regulation or whether it's litigation, where we've changed incentives for manufacturers to improve the safety of their products, and we've seen big improvements in product safety in response.
Let me ask other witnesses whether they have a view on that question. Ms. Sanchez-Gomez, do you have an opinion?
Thank you, Senator. As a litigator, I know that litigation is an incredibly powerful tool in creating incentives for any industry, and the gun industry in particular, to change its behavior to address problems that it knows its products are causing in communities. And I think the repeal of PLACA would be an incredible step in that direction.
Ms. O'Donnell?
I'm not a lawyer, so I don't litigate anything, but I think if anything to get these high-powered and fast-firing weapons off the streets is great.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Okay. We'll just give my colleague a moment to get settled in.
So, welcome. Ms. Sanchez-Gomez, what do you foresee as the legal perils to bump stock bans at the state level? And what legal safeguards do you see, assuming that a state like mine, Rhode Island, has a ban on bump stocks? To what extent do you think that is a safeguard, or is it one that can be overruled by Congress, for instance?
I think that there is no constitutional impediment to regulating bump stocks. The Supreme Court has made incredibly clear that machine guns can be regulated, that machine guns are unprotected by the Second Amendment, and bump stocks are machine guns in that they approximate rates of fire that can only be achieved by fully automatic weapons. The Supreme Court, in its recent decision, while it said that ATF could not bring bump stocks within the federal definition of machine gun, it did invite Congress to act to do just that. And I think in doing that, it suggested very strongly that Congress could do this constitutionally, and that states, of course, could also do this.
Well, indulge me in the hypothetical that we end up with a Congress that makes bump stock bans illegal. At the state level.
At the state level.
Tries to repeal or override state-level bump stock bans. How do you see that fitting into the constitutional matrix?
Well, a state is welcome to repeal a bump stock ban if it so chooses, but I think that would be a dangerous choice because these weapons are incredibly dangerous. They allow a person to shoot a weapon in a way that it increases the lethality of that weapon and ultimately sacrifices the accuracy in doing so. These are weapons that are very dangerous for people to own. We've been regulating machine guns on the federal level for a very long time, and it's precisely because of the sort of features that a bump stock gives to a rifle.
Do you think Congress has the constitutional authority to override local laws against bump stocks?
If Congress were to pass a law regulating bump stocks, I think it would be in addition to. I think that Congress absolutely has the authority to ban bump stocks on the federal level by bringing bump stocks within the federal definition of machine gun.
Yeah, I'm clear on that. What I'm worried about is that Congress in years ahead will go the opposite direction and ban not bump stocks, but bump stock bans.
That's an interesting question, Senator. I'm not sure that I'm prepared to answer exactly that particular issue of federal law.
If you don't mind taking that as a question for the record and responding, I'd be gratified.
I'd be very happy to. Thank
Thanks
you.
very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you to the panel for your testimony. The record will be open for 1 week for submission of materials, and if there are any further questions from the colleagues who were precluded from attending today. This is an issue of life and death and should be viewed as such, just not a political debate. And the question we have before us is whether this Congress, whoever controls it, is going to try to make America safer. I certainly hope we do. We owe it to the people of this country. So thank you all for coming today, and with that, the hearing stands adjourned.